The Reserve Bank of India's new framework for stressed asset management came out late Monday, and we're trying to understand the implications of that move. Joining us is Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Mr. Sanyal, very good morning. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us. First thoughts, Mr. Sanyal. I mean, I suppose the view that we're getting from everybody is that this was a natural next step now that we have an IBC in place and all of the individual schemes were in some ways muddying the waters. Is that how you see it as well, sir?
Yes, I mean, we had this large number of schemes, processes and so on, which were very, very complicated. So what we have done is we have removed a large number of these and replaced them with what is a generic framework. It's a simple, clear framework, which hopefully everybody can recognize and implement. It's also reasonably flexible. So should there be any reason to change it, it's at least clear what we are changing. You see, the earlier scheme or set of schemes were, they were overlapping procedures, confusing acronyms. So now we have a system that is generic. It's a framework. Of course, more things will be added into it to make it work. But I think all parties know now what the framework itself is. And, we already have further downstream the IBC process. So that has now more or less got going. So the upstream part, which is the recognition of the NPA in the first instance, that has now been given some sort of a clear framework.
Mr. Sanyal, it's flexible, yes, but in some ways it's also fairly prescriptive, isn't it? I mean, there are very strict deadlines, and I'm not saying they're unjustified. We've had a terrible experience of the last few years, so we're probably learning from that. But on banks, it's a fairly sort of strict timeline to put that 180 days, even in cases where you have 20 odd banks involved to come together, everybody agrees on a resolution plan. If not, go straight to IBC. Is that a little tough?
Well, we'll have to see how this goes. Obviously, we don't want various unintended consequences of these things. But, it's 180 days is not a short period of time, 6 months, in which hopefully a resolution plan will be put together. But, one thing is happening is very early on, you're also recognizing this. So earlier the problem was you spent a large amount of time simply recognizing that there was a problem. There was no central repository of knowledge which everybody got informed that there was a problem emerging in a certain entity. So that time has already been, reduced, because now, very, very quickly everybody knows that there is an issue. Now, of course, we need the banks also to respond quickly and come up with a resolution plan. You're raising a valid issue. Otherwise, everything ends up in the NCLT and the NCLT gets clogged. So the whole process now has to be smoothened out. But yes, I mean, 180 days has been put in place for the time being, and the judgment is that this is a reasonable enough time to come up with a resolution plan. You don't have to implement all of it, by the way. This is just merely to come up with one.
Sure. Mr. Sanyal, on that specific point about reporting default within a week for credits above 5 crore, I believe, do you think the next step to that is to making this CRILC public in some ways, going back to what SEBI had attempted to do, which is, inform the public about defaults in listed companies? Then that was withdrawn because there was some confusion about what default is, although I'm not sure why. But now with this in place, do you think the next logical step is to have that default in public knowledge, sir?
I wouldn't presume to announce a next step. This is what it is as it stands. We will see what happens as a result of it, take feedback and adjust it along the way.
On the issue of what the implications are, Mr. Sanyal, and I'm putting to you what views we've gotten over the last 24 hours or so. One impression is that you will see the reported NPA number rise closer to the overall stressed asset number, particularly as accounts in that 60 to 90-day bucket, we may not be able to get resolved in the remaining time frame. Is that a fair understanding? And B, the understanding is that provisions will most certainly rise even if the first scenario doesn't play out.
Let's see how it goes. I mean, as you know, we have recognized a very large number of NPAs over the last year or two, and various resolution processes have been put in place. Sure, there may be a one-time increase since the recognition process has now been so much sped up and made much more transparent. But by and large, I think things will settle down. It's a much fairer, cleaner system. And as I said, we will see how this plays out and make adjustments if necessary. But frankly, this is, as I said, a transparent system for whatever it's worth. As I said, it's not as if that as soon as you recognize that there is a problem, you suddenly take them straight to liquidation. There is a 180-day process. Then there is a 15-day further for actually, putting it into NCLT. Another 180 days to come up with resolution. A 30-day further extension, and so on. So there is a long way till some forced resolution happens. Along the way, many forms of recovery, resolution, etc., can be attempted. And really, that is the part that now needs to be strengthened.
Mr. Sanyal, there's also a question, I can't call it a fear, but a question as to what the extent of liquidation would be with, perhaps a larger number of cases going into IBC, and then you start to talk about the implications for, jobs, the economy. Your sense, Mr. Sanyal, on the risk there, I don't know if it's possible to pin it down, but do you see that as a risk?
See, we have gone through that process already last year. I mean, where a large number of cases, very large cases, accounting for 2/3 of the NPAs, were identified by the RBI. First a case, 12 cases, and then another 40 cases. And yes, these kinds of efforts may cause some pain. But I think the one-time adjustment to taking our system to becoming much more modernized, responsive to as information evolves, that the financial system is able to quickly respond to these things. In some cases there may also be liquidation, auction, and so on, but that is not the intention of this. The intention of this is that you quickly recognize that there is a problem and begin to work with the entity to try and resolve it. And as I said, that part has to be strengthened so that, as you correctly pointed out, everything doesn't have to turn up into the IBC. So that is not the intention of this.
What is your estimate of the early experience under the IBC? I know early days yet, but what do you think is, is it flowing as quickly, as smoothly as you thought or hoped it would? There are some challenges in large cases which may delay the timeline, Mr. Sanyal.
Certainly, I mean, it was a completely brand new system. Remember that. So in some ways, we had to learn along the way. But nevertheless, I think the NCLT has worked reasonably well. Even before we end, you actually see the end point of that process. You have seen a major culture change in the corporate sector and in the banking sector. The banks have now become much more serious about recognizing and providing for the NPAs, and similarly, you've seen there is a clear recognition in the corporate sector that eternal evergreening is no longer something they can expect, and that resolution of some sort will have to be carried out. You have seen many promoters getting rid of various inefficient investments. Overall, when all of this is happening, it makes the overall economy much more efficient when you carry this out. It also means that prospectively going forward, when investments are made, more thought will be given about the amount of capital being deployed, why it's being deployed, because remember, this capital has other uses as well. So if an inefficient user preempts it, it leads to it basically means that other investments were not made. So, cleaning this up was very, very important. Now, you're absolutely right that, during the transition, some pain does get inflicted on the economy. We saw that in 2017 that, the economy has now recovered from that. You can see the IIP numbers beginning to come back, and so on. So, we have gone through the transition, we have more than survived it, and in the end of the process, you'll have a much healthier banking system.
Please, sir, but just the collateral damages. So one point I want to check with you, actually 2 points I want to ask you about. One is that do we risk a scenario where the banking system is very sort of averse to lending to large corporates? And I also point to a reform package which had been announced by the government, which said that you have to limit your exposure to corporate credit at 25%, I think. That put together with the enormous pain that the banking system has gone through on account of corporate credit, do you think we risk a scenario where people just don't want to lend to large investment sort of projects or infrastructure projects?
See, there's always a risk that you will swing from one extreme to the other. So, that is a part of economic management. This is not about the framework, but about managing transitions, managing expectations, managing the work culture. So, yes, it's something that is an ongoing thing, and it needs to be monitored and adjusted to. You cannot, there is no quick formula to this. It's a risk that exists. We are aware of this risk, and we will, have to manage it.
The other point is what came up in the economic survey, slightly more theoretical, is that the recovery in terms of the investment cycle from, a balance sheet driven slowdown could be very, very slow. In India's case, Mr. Sanyal, what is your sense of, how quickly we could recover from this in terms of getting the investment to GDP ratios up, sir?
Well, I'm no longer in the business of forecasting in that sense. The point is that I think the recent numbers have suggested that the economy is recovering. The global economy is also recovering, which also is a good thing because it means that exports and other things will also hopefully pick up with it. So the idea here is that as the economy adjusts to this new ecosystem of GST, IBC, and so on, that we will now be able to begin growing with the new paradigm in place. The transition from that earlier paradigm to this one obviously led to various friction to the system. But I think now we are in the new paradigm and we have got to make this one work.
One last question, Mr. Sanyal. This sort of new I don't know if it's new, SME lending has existed forever, but this sudden sort of, every statement talking about SME lending, from the government, from the RBI, what's going on here? I understand the need to lend more to SMEs, but there have been other issues there as to, whether these companies have the required paperwork, etc., to be able to, get credit from banks. Do we not again run the risk of pushing too hard on one particular segment, and it could end up coming in it could be the new infrastructure, if I can put it very bluntly, of the next few years?
You see, as you said, the cleanup of the banks disproportionately hurt this segment for a very simple reason. This segment relies almost entirely on the banking system because they don't have the kind of access to capital markets that larger players have. So in that sense, we do need to handhold them a little bit. And the same thing happened with GST. Unlike the very larger players, they are not in very often not in a position to hire lawyers and accountants and so on to take them through the transition. So some of them did have difficulties. We recognize this. So I think we do need to handhold them a little bit. In the end, the SMEs are a source of resilience to the economy. They're a source of jobs, innovation, and so on. So it is not unfair that we put some special effort looking at their needs.
All right, Mr. Sanyal, lovely chatting with you this morning. Thanks so much for stopping by to share your thoughts on what's been happening in the banking space. Big development, of course, on Monday. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.